Welcome to the deep dive. Ready to go deep? Today we're diving into breakups. Well, not the actual act of breaking up, but, the why. Why she decided to end the relationship. And we've got some really interesting firsthand accounts from women, real stories about walking away.
And it's fascinating, because even though each story is unique and personal, you start to see these common threads, these recurring reasons that keep popping up. And what's striking is that these aren't like surface level issues. It's not about forgetting to take out the trash.
No, definitely not about whose turn it is to do the dishes.
Right. It gets way deeper than that. It's really about the core of what women are looking for in a relationship, how they want to feel, and what happens when those needs just aren't being met.
Okay, so less about dirty laundry, more about emotional needs.
Mm.
Got it. So where do we even begin with unpacking all of this?
Well, the sources use this phrase emotional disconnect, and I think it's a great place to start because it's more complex than it might seem at first glance. We're not just talking about a lack of saying, I love you enough. It's about something deeper.
Go on, I'm listening.
It's like this feeling of, I don't know, like your inner world, your thoughts, feelings, vulnerabilities.
Mhm.
They just don't seem to register as that important to your partner.
Hmm. So it's like he's totally engrossed in the game while you're trying to have a serious conversation.
Exactly. One woman in the files described it as feeling invisible. Like he was there physically, but mentally and emotionally, he was checked out.
I was, yeah, I can see how that would be hurtful. And over time, I bet that really takes a toll on your self-esteem, feeling like you're not being seen or heard in your own relationship.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting how this emotional disconnect often goes hand in hand with the next big reason that came up, which is communication breakdown. Now, obviously, every couple argues, right? That's just part of being in a relationship.
Right. Disagreements are inevitable.
Exactly. But it's not really about the arguments themselves. It's about how those arguments happen and, more importantly, how they're resolved or not resolved, as the case may be.
So are you actually resolving those conflicts, or are you just kind of sweeping them under the rug until the next fight?
Exactly. A lot of the women in these accounts talk about reaching a breaking point when they feel like they're always the ones initiating those difficult conversations, trying to find compromises, trying to work through things, and their efforts are met with, resistance or even worse, indifference.
Wow. Yeah. It's like they're going through life's challenges as a solo act, not as a team. And speaking of teamwork, or the lack thereof, that kind of leads us to another major theme that emerged, which I have a feeling will resonate with a lot of our listeners: unequal partnerships.
And I'm guessing we're not talking about who's on dish duty more often.
Definitely not. We're going deeper here. We're talking about that often invisible mountain of emotional labor and mental load that, let's be honest, tends to fall more heavily on women in many relationships.
Oh, absolutely. And that can be exhausting.
Totally. Think about it. The mental gymnastics of managing a household, keeping track of appointments, remembering birthdays, packing lunches, making sure everyone has clean socks, and on top of that, trying to hold down a job and have some semblance of a life outside of all that.
It's like having another job, except you don't get paid for it.
Exactly. And the sources really emphasize how this burden, this invisible workload, can breed resentment. It's like resentment thrives in environments where one person feels unseen and unappreciated for all the effort they're putting in.
It's like running a marathon where only one person gets the medal at the end.
Speaking of feeling unappreciated, that actually segues perfectly into another big reason why she left that came up again and again in these accounts: the feeling of being taken for granted, or as one woman put it, like a ghost in my own home.
Mm.
But before we get into the specifics of that, I want to shift gears for a moment and talk about something way heavier, something that came up in several of these stories and really shook me: the betrayal of trust, specifically through infidelity.
Yeah, we're definitely moving into heartbreak territory now. This isn't about forgetting to pick up the dry cleaning. This is a major, major rupture in the foundation of a relationship.
Right. This is like a relationship earthquake, not just a little tremor.
Exactly. And what's so interesting is that even in cases where forgiveness was possible after infidelity, the women we heard from really emphasized how incredibly difficult it was to truly rebuild that foundation of trust that had been shattered.
Because how do you just erase that breach of trust? It's like trying to build a house on a foundation that's full of cracks. You can patch it up, but it's always going to be fragile.
One woman actually said, and I quote, It was like there was this part of me that always doubted him after that, no matter how hard I tried to move on. So even when there's a desire to repair the relationship, that damage from infidelity can linger for a really long time.
It really makes you realize that sometimes, even with the best intentions, some wounds are just too deep to ever fully heal. Okay, so we've covered feeling unseen, unheard, taken for granted, and betrayed. Now let's talk about what happens when couples start to grow in different directions. What about when life takes you on different paths?
Ah, yes, the classic growing apart scenario. And this one's particularly interesting because it's not always a sign of a bad relationship. People change, goals evolve, priorities shift, and sometimes those paths just naturally diverge.
Which is a normal part of life, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're not the same people at 30 that we were at 20.
Yeah.
So how do you know when that natural evolution crosses the line into a relationship deal breaker?
Right, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Yeah,
All right.
that is the million-dollar question. And what the sources kind of point to this idea of, are you growing together still, or are you like on these diverging paths that just feel impossible to bridge?
Like, give me an example.
Okay, so say one partner has this like awakening and they're suddenly all about like a vegan lifestyle, meditation retreats, the whole 9 yards.
Okay, I'm seeing where you're going with this.
Right. And meanwhile, the other partner is totally content with their burger and a beer routine. And listen, both are totally valid ways to live your life, but
But it could be a recipe for disaster if those differences aren't at least acknowledged and, respected.
exactly. One woman even put it this way. She said it was like they were on two different escalators going in opposite directions.
Ouch.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's a powerful visual. And, it makes me think about how much our individual growth and evolution impacts our relationships. And sometimes, those changes can actually bring you closer together.
Wow.
But other
Other
times,
times it can create this distance that's really hard to overcome. And speaking of feeling unseen and unappreciated, that kind of leads us to another really common reason that kept popping up in these accounts, which is what the sources call the erosion of appreciation.
it sounds almost romantic in a way, but I have a feeling it's anything but.
Oh, absolutely not. It's actually kind of a slow burn, but it can be a really significant factor in why women ultimately decide to leave. And it often boils down to those little things that accumulate over time.
Those small gestures that maybe she used to do at the beginning of the relationship or that she does consistently, but he just doesn't seem to notice or reciprocate.
Exactly. And over time, that lack of appreciation starts to chip away at her sense of self-worth within the relationship.
Yeah, it's like her efforts become invisible, like she's blending into the background instead of being front and center in his life.
And it's not about wanting grand gestures every day. It's about that consistent feeling of being seen, valued, appreciated for all those little things we do for the people we love.
Because when that appreciation fades,
Mhm.
it can be so hard to reignite that spark, right?
It really can. It's like trying to water a plant that's already shriveled up from lack of attention.
And unfortunately, sometimes those relationship struggles, they can escalate into something far more serious and damaging.
Which brings us to the final, and I think arguably the most important reason why she left that we're going to unpack today, which is toxicity.
And, just to be clear for our listeners, we're not talking about the occasional argument or disagreement here. We're talking about a pattern of behavior that's emotionally damaging and unhealthy.
Absolutely. This is about those relationships where leaving becomes an act of self-preservation,
Hmm.
a way to reclaim your own sense of safety and worth and well-being.
And the sources we've been diving into don't shy away from the harsh realities of what that toxicity can look like. And in some cases, we're talking about emotional abuse, manipulation, control, even physical violence.
And it's important to remember that toxicity doesn't always show up in these like big dramatic ways. It can be very subtle.
Yeah, it can be disguised as, just having a strong personality or being protective.
Exactly. And it often starts small, but over time it chips away at your self-esteem, makes you question your own judgment, your own sanity even.
Like that partner who's constantly criticizing your appearance or your choices or isolating you from your friends and family, so you become totally dependent on them.
Yes, and the sources are full of these heartbreaking stories of women who endured these patterns for years, often blaming themselves or making excuses for the other person's behavior.
Which is why it's so important to talk about this openly and honestly, to shine a light on these insidious forms of abuse
Yeah.
so that anyone out there listening who might be trapped in a toxic relationship can recognize the signs and know that they're not alone.
Absolutely, because leaving a toxic relationship is a process. It's not easy. It takes immense courage and strength, and often involves a lot of fear, guilt, self-doubt.
But as one woman so powerfully put it, choosing myself was the hardest but most empowering decision I ever made.
Wow, yeah, that's powerful. And it speaks to the incredible resilience of the human spirit, doesn't it? Even in the face of such difficult circumstances.
Wow, that was a lot to process. We really went deep there, huh? I mean, when we started this episode, I don't think either of us were expecting it to be like a walk in the park. But these conversations, even though they're tough, they're so important to have.
Yeah, no doubt. And it's interesting because even though we've been focusing on, why relationships end, on the reasons women choose to leave, it really highlights what we all deserve in a partnership.
Totally. It's like by understanding those deal breakers, it actually clarifies what really matters.
Absolutely. And going through these women's stories, what really struck me was how often they talked about finally choosing themselves. Like, leaving wasn't just about escaping a bad situation, it was about creating space for something better.
It's like they were reclaiming their lives and their happiness. And that takes guts.
So much courage to look at a situation, even one you've invested so much in, and say, this isn't serving me anymore. I deserve more. I mean, wow, that's powerful.
It really is. And you know what? It makes me think that maybe the takeaway here isn't just about romantic relationships, right?
I think you're onto something there.
It's about all our relationships. Friendships, family, the relationship we have with ourselves.
Yes, because ultimately, don't we all deserve to feel seen, heard, appreciated, respected?
100%. And sometimes creating those healthy relationships means having those tough conversations, setting boundaries, and yes, even walking away from those relationships that are no longer serving us.
It's about recognizing our own worth and knowing that we deserve to be in relationships that bring us joy, not pain. Relationships that lift us up, not tear us down.
Beautifully said. Well, listeners, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this deep dive. What resonated with you? What insights will you be taking away from these women's stories? Keep those conversations going, both with yourselves and with us. And until next time, stay curious.